Welcome again, everyone, to the session on guiding LSSTC's fundraising efforts. A bit more than a decade ago, LSST Corporation used approximately $30 million of gifts from private philanthropists to get LSST started. So as the name of the survey telescope, Simone Survey Telescope attests, from the very beginning, Rubin Observatory LSST has been a public-private partnership. And today, we'd like to give you all the opportunity to have a say in guiding for the future, the private part of that public-private partnership. My name is Jeno Sokoloski. I'm the Director for Science at LSST Corporation. Serving as our moderator today is Dan Petroselli, our Senior Director for Development, and another member of our staff, Kim Briamonte, has kindly agreed to serve as scribe. I'll start out with just about a 20-minute reminder about what the corporation, or LSSTC, is, and then we will randomly distribute you into breakout rooms, small rooms with about 5 people, and ask you to think about and discuss a set of questions that I'll show later in my slides and that are also posted on the agenda page for this session to help us figure out what does the community want from our fundraising efforts. As you've seen multiple times so far this week, here's a reminder that you did sign a code of conduct. And in this session, since we will be working in small discussion groups, it's a great opportunity for you to practice those principles of kindness, trust, and support for diversity and inclusion that are the part of the core values of Rubin Observatory. You've also seen this reminder multiple times about how to use the different communication channels. For today, we appreciate if you can use Slack if you have any questions. Our moderator, Dan Petroselli, will be looking first and foremost at Slack to see if there are any questions. So, what is LSST Corporation? As some of you already know, we are a member-based nonprofit. So, sort of like the Sierra Club is a nonprofit, and whereas their goal is protecting the environment, our goal is to maximize the scientific output and societal impact of Rubin LSST. And as you will see if you attend our session tomorrow, part of that societal impact involves fostering diversity, equity, and inclusion. You might notice that this goal is very similar to the goal that we heard Melissa Graham mention earlier for the community engagement team. So, however, one thing that's different is our strategy. So we are looking to achieve this goal by using private philanthropy to initiate programs that will have wide benefit in the LSST community. And so as the community engagement team that Melissa discussed gets more established, I hope that we can work very closely with them using our 2 different strategies towards this same goal. Now, I mentioned we're a member-based nonprofit. So again, similar to the Sierra Club or some other nonprofit, but different. Whereas an organization like that has members that are individual people. For us, our members are institutions. So currently we have about 30 institutions that are members of LSST Corporation, and those constitute departments that have decided that they want their full department to take advantage of LSST when the data start flowing, and not just a few individual researchers, and they've stepped up to join the corporation and be part of this effort to bring private philanthropy into the sphere of the LSST ecosystem. Speaking of the broader ecosystem, to understand where we fit, so the corporation is currently distinct from the federally funded construction project, and as it will be from operations, although as you heard in my intro, we have a long relationship with the project, and in fact, got LSST started. We're also distinct from, but work very closely with the science collaborations. Federica Bianco mentioned earlier that one of our seats on our executive board is reserved for the coordinator for the science collaborations. And we also have a science collaborations advisory committee. So our close work with the science collaborations is one of the ways in which we get input from the scientific community about programs, tools, other things that would be of value in preparing for LSST. So this is just a review of some of our programs. Some may be familiar to you. For example, the Enabling Science Small Grants Program is one of our very popular programs. It's currently in its 6th year. And as we just announced the new awards, soon 84 distinct projects will have been funded through this program. Now here I say projects, the vast majority of those are workshops. We also support the Data Science Fellowship Program, another very in-demand program that shows in part the demand in the community for training. This is, I think we're finishing the 4th year of the Data Science Fellowship Program, and that's typically oversubscribed, or at least it has been in the last year or two, by a factor of 20. And before this year, we have been able to bring undergrads, fund them to travel to the project and community workshop. Unfortunately, because of COVID, that is not happening right now, but that's another way in which we support the involvement of students in the LSST endeavor. In addition to those programs, we've been exploring a type of model of workshop that provides us a way to address one of the issues that's come up repeatedly already at this meeting. Federica Bianco talked about it extensively in the other science collaborations, which is the dearth of funding for science collaborations who are doing the vital preparatory work for LSST. So some examples are, we recently, or 2 years ago, had a Cadence Hackathon, through which we were able to provide honoraria to some people who wrote white papers, which is usually a very thankless job. And in another workshop with which we partnered with Las Cumbres Observatory, we were able to provide some seed funding to a set of teams that will be or are beta testing some of the software that Las Cumbres is developing, the Target and Observation Manager, or TOM toolkit software. Now, because we recently announced the 2020 Enabling Science Awards, I want to show you just a listing of those projects for this year. I don't expect you to actually be able to read this whole slide, but if you notice at the top, there is in red a website, and you can go there to get more information about the projects that were selected for funding this year. But I did want to point out the distribution of these very impactful projects, the Enabling Science Awards for the year, that generally end up being very impactful. So those highlighted in green are 9 workshops that will be funded. There are also 2 summer student research programs highlighted in blue on the lower left, and a data challenge highlighted in orange on the lower right. I also want to draw your attention to the fact that among the workshops, 4 of them are PI'd by researchers located outside of the United States. So this will come up again later as one of the advantages of working with private philanthropy as opposed to federal funding is that we have the freedom to fund researchers outside of the US. So I mentioned the Enabling Science projects. Those are typically small awards of $20,000 or less. And some of our other projects are in the ballpark of 100 or 200,000, the seed funding workshops and a workshop related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, a whole program that I'll talk about tomorrow. But we are actually aiming to go much higher than this in terms of our ability to support scientists in the community. The reason we're aiming to go higher is because estimates of the need in the community to fully prepare for Rubin LSST that have been made by members of our board come to about tens of millions of dollars. So that's obviously a huge amount of funding that's needed. And that typically, that would cover 3 areas mainly: tools that are often called the community or user-generated analysis tools, the development of those tools, training at all levels, and support for the new types of collaborations and that are needed in for a facility that's going to produce such enormous data sets. So in order to be able to pitch such a large amount of, to raise such an amount of money, we've put together an umbrella program that brings together a variety of types of programs that are both complementary but distinct. And we call this the LSST Interdisciplinary Network for Collaboration in Computing. Nickname is LINCC, and you might have heard me talk about this last year at the Project and Community Workshop. I also mentioned it then. Now we're still fundraising for this program, although we've made some progress and are currently in discussion with a foundation about funding several pieces of this large umbrella program. So what it is a way to wrap together a bunch of programs, for example, postdoctoral fellowships, workshops, and that would include things like summer schools as well as traditional workshops, or data challenges with and without seed funding, incubators and visiting fellowship programs, and ideally with grant support. But to bring them together into one program that we could pitch at one time to a very high capacity donor, these programs would be coordinated through a network of data science centers that we envision growing with time. And at these centers would sit teams of software engineers that would work with local academics to lead the development of some of the community or user-generated tools that are most needed by the research community. So as I mentioned, in a few minutes, we're gonna split up into breakout rooms. But before we do that, I wanna give you a little bit of guidance about the difference between federal grants and private philanthropy. Here on the left is my picture of how rigid sometimes things are with private grants. There are clearly defined opportunities. There are regular published deadlines, open to all US researchers, and tend to have very strict rules. On the other hand, or in contrast for private philanthropy, although in some cases they're clearly defined opportunities, in a lot of other cases, those opportunities must be discovered through conversations or existing relationships that we have spent a lot of time developing with potential donors and foundations. Also, donors' interests and constraints can be fluid. For example, whereas for NSF grant, or let's say you're applying to some federal grant, it's pretty clear what the parameters are, what kind of programs would be of interest to the review panels, which many of us have sat on. With a private donor, it's possible to have a conversation. So you can pitch an idea, for example, LINCC, and a donor might say, oh, wow, I'm not so interested in this part, but I like this part. And then there's some flexibility there in terms of having a conversation with the donor. Also, as I mentioned earlier, many private philanthropists are perfectly happy with funding researchers outside of the US. And in some cases, although not all, are fine with funding tools, the development of tools and infrastructure. Although, of course, in some cases, there is also a desire for a scientific discovery in the near term, but some really care about tools. And that tends to be a different kind of model than we are used to with federal grants. So what we're doing as the corporation is to seek private philanthropy for projects with community-wide value that are particularly hard to fund with federal grants. Of course, the reason being that all of the science community has access to standard federal grants. And so we're trying to do something different, fill those holes in what actually can be funded. So we reached out to the chairs of the science collaborations and asked for ideas for what would they most like us to fundraise for. And here are some examples of things they said. Mentorship programs, connecting the science collaborations with historically Black colleges and universities came up. Online collaboration software platform, for example, for follow-up planning and discussion of interesting targets. Programs specifically designed to support those international collaborations, those parts that your colleagues that can't get funded through your NSF awards. Regular and innovative format meetings, including things like boot camps for newcomers to LSST. And finally, grants for preparatory work. And some examples are cadence optimization or development of some machine learning techniques. Now, this is the hardest one in some sense, because to approach a private donor, it's very important for us to have a specific project. And those projects are most valuable if they serve the wider community. And so since we're about to go into the breakout groups, and Kim, it looks like we might be able to get there at the original time that you suggested. So before we go into those breakout groups, I'd like everyone who's going to participate to think about what work they would like to do that would also benefit the broader community. So as opposed to what you would do if you just had one postdoc for your own research, what would you do with your postdoc that would also benefit others in the community? Okay, so now we are going to go into the breakout rooms. And I won't read all these instructions for you. They're available on the agenda, so you can go there. But just quickly, you're going to be sent into breakout rooms randomly with 4 other people. And first thing you should do is select a timekeeper. You'll have a total of about 25 minutes, 25 to 30 minutes. You'll introduce yourselves to each other, select a moderator and a scribe, and then on the right-hand side of this page, you'll see a few questions that would like you to address. And then afterwards, Kevin Ryle, who's kindly serving as our host, will bring everyone back to the main Zoom session. And I'd like to ask the people who are scribes to not only take notes during the session, ideally in a Google Doc, so you could share it with us or some other way of sharing it, but they would also think about one takeaway from your discussion, that something you found interesting or novel or noteworthy, that you can then put in the Slack channel so that the other participants in the other groups can see that. Okay, so Kevin, if you want to go ahead and put people in their rooms, let's try it.
Apologies to a few people at the start. You might have got kicked out of your room and into another one. We had several people that wanted to stay back or had to stay back in the main room for legal reasons. So I had to rearrange a little, but I think most of you had 23 or 4 minutes together. So Jeno.
Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks for participating. And if each group could ask their scribes to maybe share at least, share their notes with Kim Briamonte at kbriamonte@lsst.org up there. That would help us get a sense of what you discussed and maybe help guide our fundraising. And if the moderator or scribe could also type one at least thought that came out of your session in Slack. I know we had some really interesting directions that we discussed that were unexpected. And so I would appreciate if people could share those on Slack and maybe have a look at what other groups discussed. And since we have a few minutes and I see Allison Rose, I will just tell you that one of the groups that came up, one of the ideas that came up in our session was little video clips of things like the lightning talks that started off some of the sessions at the Project and Community Workshop. And those have been so popular at the project and community workshop. And one of our participants pointed out how valuable it is to hear a successful scientist say that they weren't good at something or they had some early failures, and how that important that is to outreach to students and other people. And so I mentioned that we had already a relationship with a documentary filmmaker, and there you are. So anyway, just to bring that up.
Thanks.
And since we have a few minutes left, does anyone from any of the other groups actually want to mention an idea that came up in your session in addition to typing it in the Slack channel?
Sure, I'll jump in.
Go for it, Chuck.
So in our group, we had an interesting conversation. I think the common thread in the conversation, and I was just typing it into the Slack channel, so I'll finish that up when I'm done. But the common thread was the need to support people at the graduate level and at the postdoc level. And you know, probably exposing a little personal bias about thinking big, not necessarily, you know, the support of individual programs is really good, but I think there's some interest in thinking even bigger and establishing, you know, for example, an endowment, you know, go after philanthropy, not just for targeted things, but just for a more general endowment that then, you know, perpetuates the support throughout the LSST survey. And also, we also acknowledge that there is a disparity between how ground-based astronomy is funded and supported versus space programs. So most space programs funded through NASA have built in to their funding profile the support of science, where in ground-based astronomy, that's not the case. And so, you know, currently the main funding support for ground-based astronomy is the grants program in NSF AST. And this is where I think LSSTC plays a critical role in doing science for the survey that we're about to do. And so that's why I think thinking longer term, bigger picture, establishing a foundational fund base as in an endowment, if that could be established, that would be a huge asset to the astronomy community. So I'll get off my soapbox.
In our last 4 minutes, is anyone else willing to share an interesting thought from their discussion group? Pat?
Yeah, so we discussed engaging students in research and also mentoring them. But one of our thoughts was to start at the high school level, capturing the interest of students early, engaging them in research because research has shown that the involving students in research helps them think of themselves as scientists early on. And so a way to diversify the field by going even earlier in their careers.
Thanks.
All right, I'll have a quick one. Tim Holt here. We just pointed out that this was one of the things that I brought up, but we had a lot of things that echo other people. But anyway, international data rights, because at the moment it's all well and good to have international funding, but if international data rights don't come with that, and at the moment the only way the international community can get those data rights is in-kind contributions. So it's a catch-22 of, yes, you can provide international funding, but you may not be able to, that scientist may not have data rights to go with it. Particularly if it's a postdoctoral program or something like that, that can be done sort of in collaboration with a US institute, but perhaps there might be an opportunity to to have standalone data rights for people through the LSSTC.
Thanks for sharing. It's a big one. But I appreciate the issue, right? We can only people can only participate if they have data rights, and that is, you know, that's a big issue. So. I think we probably have time for one more person to share if their group came up with something that surprised them.
Well, I guess I wasn't so much surprised, but I wanted to echo the conversation that started with, we just go back into where Allison, who's working on the documentary work, and in terms of telling stories through people about the survey, about Rubin, about the LSST, I think is incredibly valuable, and be fantastic for not just the public, but for all of us. I'm really glad that.
Thanks. I got cut off and I'm sorry. And I'm always afraid I'm going on too long. But I really think that the document, what I can contribute is a kind of pre-apostolate. You're telling stories to the general public and feeding them to EPO and feeding them to then school programs, but inspiring everybody to see us as all on this journey of space exploration. And I think it supports sustainability, it supports justice, because what the stories model is codes of conduct, safety first, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I can choose to follow a diversity of people. It's like upstairs, downstairs. Some of the programming can be about the leadership and construction, and that's a particular demographic. And at least half of the storytelling can be about young people. It can just be as diverse as we want. Mm-hmm. And I say we because even though I'm not a part of the project, I really feel a sense of ownership of this. But my goal is to support, to take the transformational power of Rubin Observatory and make it even more transformational, because I think that potential is there. So I am looking for a lot of money, and I don't want to be competing with you, but I do believe that if my project can be funded, it supports everything.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I think we reached our end time. So I'd like to thank everyone very much for participating. And again, remind the scribes from each group, if you're able to send your notes to Kim at the email that was shown earlier, we would find that very helpful. Okay, thanks everyone.